we're now in this terrible situation that those of us who know what's going on have no mechanism by which to reach the people. Because A, we're denied access to the instruments of discussion, and secondly, we're demonized. So these poor people who are going to suffer as a result of this, and their children's lives are going to be destroyed, will not hear us because we're deemed to be far right or whatever it is. This is shocking, because I know the day will come when they will realize that they were misled and that they might have saved themselves. They might have saved their children's happiness and hopes. But that moment was lost because they didn't hear a correct description of what was happening at the right time. They keep people in line, you know, it's like when you have to herd a flock of sheep down a road and into a gate, you got to have somebody standing just beyond the gate to turn them in. And that's basically what you have. You have the chief shepherd and the proxies who keep everybody in line. And then we're headed towards the gate to hell.
But in his 20s, this young man wants to talk to us about an idea he has on the soapbox that he wants to put to the people of Ireland, and he is firmly convinced that he is right about this idea. Now, it sounds heavy, but it's not. Stay with us now. Stay with us. It's about the national debt. He reckons that you should skip it, repudiate it, renege on it, welch on it, refuse to pay it. That's the end of it. You welcome, please, John Waters.
It is a basic moral issue. Should we deprive our people of the necessities for a good, healthy, decent, dignified life in our country? Or should we deprive a handful of fat cat bankers of a relatively small amount of extra profit? It really is as simple as that. So-called experts hypnotise us with figures and balance sheets, while our real wealth is hemorrhaging from every port and airport like blood from a stuck pig. We're mad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore.
If the John then met the John now, we wouldn't know how to communicate. He would think I didn't know anything, and I would know he didn't know anything. Things were very bad then. It's very hard to imagine what it was like then if you weren't there, and how close it was to, you know, Gabriel used to say, banjaxed. We were banjaxed. We really were. Remarkable, really. 20 years from banjaxed to bonanza. Nobody predicted that it would go from that to what it is now. So you feel a bit silly in retrospect. I feel silly looking at myself, saying that, knowing what I know now. But at the time, that was the way it was. That was the fear, that those words, you know, poverty, hunger, immigration, famine, they were real. They were real ideas, and they were real dangers.
Yeah, it's very strange watching that, because there's now the three layers. There's the 1987, the original video, the Late Late Show. Then there's the 2007, I suppose, reaction to it. And there's now, which is like another kind of almost 20 years. And the strange thing is that the first and the last are, you know, in tune, in harmony. And I'm in harmony with myself. But the guy in the middle hasn't a clue. You know, it's incredible to watch that and to know that guy is actually speaking for effect. He's just speaking pragmatically out of a particular moment. And so I kind of surrendered on the economic issue for a long time. I just put up the white flag and said, look, okay, they've won. Their narrative won. They've made Ireland wealthy. Their all-Ireland victorious narrative was on their mantelpiece and not on mine. I now know that's complete nonsense. Ireland was never wealthy. It's not wealthy. Ireland is a very, very poor country. Always has been. It never succeeded in finding its own way forward in the world. I've said it repeatedly, like in recent years again, that what we did was we inherited a shop from our grandparents and couldn't figure out what to sell in it. So we rented out the shop and lived upstairs, and that's what we're still doing. That's the truth. But that guy back in 87, he knew that somehow. And then he forgot. And then he remembered. And here we are. Talk about schizophrenia. And it's really salutary, you know, because, you know, almost immediately, almost immediately, when that camera was switched off, I was wrong again. But I had been right the first time. If I just stuck to what I'd said then, on the late in 87, because that's still true. That's the kind of constant truth. That's been true all along. It's really the price of continuing to be in the mainstream, I suppose. That's one of the things in the discourse that has appeared in recent years, that it seems every nation on earth has the right to exist, except the Irish. Like, how is that not racist? You know, we have to invite the world here and celebrate them and allow them to extinguish our culture, or actually stand down our culture because they are here, because we don't want to offend them. Well, no, these things need to be addressed and we need to discuss them. And that's kind of, I think, the mission we have now as we go forward, to maintain our discussion in as much in public as we can about these important things. The role of the media is to facilitate a democratic conversation between the people, so that out of that conversation then comes the matters, the questions that are important, and accordingly the kind of facts that are called for in order to further that discussion. There is no other basis for democracy other than that. One of the functions of the journalist was to go out and speak to the expert, to try to get what they were saying into language that was comprehensible to you and therefore could be transmitted to a wider and equally ignorant public in general. That kind of has become more and more lost, because what happened over the last 20 years, you see more and more experts being asked to write op-eds in newspapers, instead of the journalists saying, okay, what's this about? Now, how do I communicate it? And this, you know, has become really dangerous and insidious process, because what it actually means is that you have lots and lots of people now who are experts in one thing. So they know more and more about less and less. So their area is shrinking, but their knowledge and the intensity of their knowledge is becoming stronger, as it were. But then you line them up and you ask them, okay, well, can you have a conversation? And they can't, because each one is just expressing a singular viewpoint about a singular thing, a very narrow band of knowledge. And none of the others have the same expertise, so they don't have an opinion of that. And there's no overarching opinion, there's no philosopher to ask hard questions or make them reconcile one with the other. All people can do then, ordinary people, all they can do is sort of learn off lines. Remember certain stock lines from such and such an expert, and just repeat this to each other and tweet it to each other. With the result that it's a babble of scientism, of quasi-science, of pseudoscience, and has no overarching philosophical governing logic or questioning. And that's because of the rank corruption of the media. I think the media was already winding up anyway. In a certain sense, what's happened here is we're in kind of time added on for the media. And that coming to an end had different elements in it. Like, one was to change the business model of media, whereby news organizations were no longer so able to seal off their product so that they could continue to monetize it as they had in the time of exclusively print or broadcast. So now you had the internet, which was able to pirate a lot of the material once it was out there. For many years, the internet has been a jungle. The other interesting thing that was, I think, undoubtedly the case was that the notion of a singular narrative had long since begun to wane. Like, I'll give you an example. I mean, when I was starting out in journalism, you could go on the Late Late Show on a Saturday night. For about a month afterwards, everybody in Ireland would have seen you and they would want to talk to you or whatever. or not, or want to shout at you, or whatever it was. You had been engaged in a discussion that was virtually quasi-national in a way that's now impossible to imagine. These are just entertainment shows. They're not civic platforms in the way that the Late Late was in the time of Gay Byrne, and particularly that last segment when he would do it, when he would have maybe 6 or 8 people in the studio and panel and talking and arguing and fighting and bringing the audience in and then going on for an extra 20 minutes or half an hour if it got really interesting or heated. Those are really kind of, I think, very pivotal discussions, and there are people who say that they had a malign effect. I don't get into that. That is the way democracy should work. And that's now gone. The idea of the singular consciousness in media terms was on the point of dying out. Now, interestingly, the COVID episode brought it back, at least briefly, where there was suddenly like a singular kind of topic, kind of a unanimity and a consensus and a complete non-stop message emanating for weeks and months on end. And I think that betrays really the future, because I think the nature of the fourth estate was about to change anyway, and is about to change if we have a future at all. All these people are anti-journalists now. They're not journalists at all. And we need to become aware of that and to understand the implications of that before we can understand how this trick was affected. And then perhaps we can think of ways of reversing the effects. What it is media that have ceased to provide the means of the national democratic conversation are still pretending that that's what they're doing. So the analogy I've used is a lot like of a walled town in which the gates are all locked and the walls are very high and it's inaccessible, but the marauding enemies of the people in the town are all around in the undergrowth in the forests nearby or whatever. When the elders of the town look out their windows as it grows dusk, they make sure that the sentries are still up along the watchtowers, and they see the figures there and they say, it's okay, we can sleep now, our women can sleep, our children are safe. What the media have done then, they are the sentries, but what they have done is that they have replaced themselves with straw men. And the straw men sit there and seem to be doing the same job as the sentries would have done. But now the town is defenceless, because the sentries have gone off to the disco in the local city or whatever, and left the town exposed and the people in the greatest peril. All these journalists are all of the same mindset. They've been trained in a particular ideological view of the world, and they're all of the view that anything that doesn't accord with that is, in some sense, wicked. They're promoting their positive ideological models, which are necessary to overcome the darkness of the past and so on. They continue to do this, even though the darkness gets darker, and they're responsible now for the darkness. They are in charge, they are in power. Their people that they have championed are in power. Although they actually, interestingly, don't ever admit to being in power. They always behave as though they are the beleaguered opposition, fighting to save, humanity from the threat of right-wing, fascist and, blah, blah, utopias and so on. They're talking about the far right, when they know there is no far right in Ireland. They know it. They know it. Like, clearly they know it. It's a joke. But they're prepared to purvey the joke because they're told to do it. That's their meal ticket. And they just wink at each other and smirk. They feel, I suppose, that they're putting one over on their enemies. But ultimately, they're putting one over on themselves, because it's only a matter of time as to when we arrive at critical mass, there are enough people to say enough already. The issue then is, will they have managed to lock the doors before that moment arrives? Will they have managed to actually imprison us all in their new paradigm? They are on the wrong side of history, clearly. They're taking the side of the most powerful, the richest forces on the planet against the ordinary people. Because if there is an accurate, truthful history, they will be regarded as an utter disgrace. The model that we see now, which is this diffused model, this variegated model of bloggers and vloggers and Telegram and YouTube and BitChute and Substack and articles and Twitter and all this stuff, which seems to be completely chaotic and random, is actually the fourth estate now. This is the public square, even though it's a chaotic place. And that's the future. There is no singular channel ever again going to talk to the people, even of a small country like Ireland. But I think that's workable. Already you can see in the resistance that this is the way they get their knowledge. And people, of course, who don't understand how it works think, oh, well, it's all disinformation, misinformation and so on. Well, of course it's not. The disinformation is on the mainstream. You form your view of the world. It's like a kind of building a dry stone wall. You have all these stones all around you. For each phase of the wall, you're looking for the right stone. So you're trying different ones and you put in. So you keep drawing your stones in from different places and trying them out and then say, okay, no, that one doesn't fit, I'll try this. And gradually the wall builds, and that's how I think this new chaotic system of media will work for people. It'll be very, very different to what we're used to. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be bad. I think on the contrary, that it calls in the intelligence and the discernment of the individual much more than the model where every headline in every newspaper is some days the same, about the same story and the same angle. And every news bulletin on every channel is the same as well. All of this accumulates and you begin to check and cross-reference things with different voices. And this is how you form your sense. And I can tell you that it's a much more reliable mode of self-education than pursuing the mainstream media. There's no future other than we begin to examine what it takes to make what you might call citizen journalism the centerpiece of the new fourth estate. And that's obviously a task for people who are not themselves journalists. This is a task for, I don't know, maybe artists, writers. But we need to find people who can actually take responsibility for this and see how it might be made possible. Media is really, it's over. It's really over, and it's impossible to imagine how it could ever be resuscitated, how you would ever restore any kind of ethicality to the existing model of media. Therefore, it must be stood down if there is to be a future at all in freedom and democracy. All of the journalists now practicing should be banned from ever writing or speaking in public again. That's a given. We need to install real journalists again. This is unprecedented. I can't imagine then Monday morning what it would be like. Who would do it and how would they do it? Where would they start looking? How would they start building? But that has to be done because there's no way that these people can ever be trusted again. But I'm not sure how that will come about. All I do know is that, human societies have reorganized themselves before to recreate freedom in their midst. And these things have been dealt with. It is important that severe penalties be handed out to people who have done these things. Not for any vindictive reason, but because the signal has to be sent out there that you can't get away with this. That human society will not allow you to destroy it in this way. This can never be repeated. That those who have done these things can never, ever again be treated as normal people in our societies. They are to be regarded as criminals until they die and afterwards. Most people, pretty much everybody, trust the world because they have to. They trust the signs and the news bulletins and the headlines and the journalists. And I have to say, I think that in a general kind of way, that was valid approximately until about a few years ago. For me, it only became unbearably impossible in 2020. It just became so clear that this was completely bogus. They just went too far. For me, people I worked with are still out there and they clearly are in the business of constructing pseudo-reality now. And they're clearly in the business of lying to people and of denying they're lying, which is another layer of lying. This is like misleading people to such an extent that is now actually for a lot of people has proved fatal. It really has. People have died because of it. It's not a small thing. It's not the normal kind of thing that you might associate with bad journalism. There's serious consequences from this. This is criminality of a kind that is so pronounced and so real that it's just about the worst thing that ever happened in lots of ways. Fundamentally, we're living in a pseudo-reality, and journalism has been a central part of that. They have to go, and their buildings have to be demolished symbolically by bulldozers in front of an audience for this lesson to be underlined sufficiently. When you saw it in the demeanour of the political classes, the viciousness of them, The sadistic demeanour that they adopted in the face of people's hurt and consternation and bemusement, the way that they callously allowed people to die on their own in rooms, kept apart from their loved ones, the way they left the abortion clinics open but they closed the churches. All this stuff, it was just like, in your face, buddy, suck it up. It's like a caricature monstrosity that manifested suddenly in the public sphere, and it seemed to infect virtually all of the actors who were representing the state, representing the government, representing the media, which is of course the state anyway. Reality as it really was now asserting itself in our lives. The way we had it in our minds before was completely kaput. It is now manifest in plain sight what the reality of human existence is like, what the reality of politics is like, what really economics is about. And all the pretenses were literally dropped overnight. It had been a con trick. This never existed. The promise of democracy, of freedom, they really were no more than baits to keep us in the game, to keep us doing what they needed us to do until they got their act together to pounce. And then they pounced. And that's really what this all was about. It was nothing to do with anybody's health, of course not. The time had come for them to assert control, because now they had the capability to do it. And everything we had believed before was bullshit, because it meant nothing in the face of this decision to act and to move. This is a battle between good and evil. It's quite clear. There are evil forces which do not have the best interests of the human race at heart, if they have hearts, have access to vast amounts of fake money, which will work for a time, and they can use it to further their interests and their well-being and so on, but ultimately will dissolve and dissipate and do nothing but destruction on the way. And against them are people who, in general, have nothing to gain from opposing them other than their lives and their freedoms. And that's the real acid test. They have everything to lose because they can lose their freedom. They are now threatened with imprisonment for even speaking and so on. They, have lost their livelihoods. They've been cancelled. Doctors, for example. The war, we realise now, was going on for a long time. It's a battle for the essence of the human being, which we call the spirit, which is that part of the human being which is total. It's a portal into the infinite and the eternal, so that we become totally ourselves, totally upward looking, totally motivated and fixated on the horizon, moving through time and space. Always moving through. This is the thing of the human being, that we are not designed to settle, to stop. And each thing that we think, which becomes the object of our desire, is doomed to disappoint us. Whether that be a drug or a person or whatever, a job or money or anything, a house, a car. All these things momentarily appear to be the answer, and then they become the opposite of the answer in a way. And that movement through seems to be how we are designed. And that it is only in that way that we optimally function as human beings in this dimension. What's going on now is a war against that understanding. We are being reduced even more than we had been to simply consumers, to simply blobs of flesh and bone moving around a piece of earth. That our function is purely economic. We have nothing to offer other than to keep the mechanism of the enrichment of the rich functioning. Never before in, I think, human history has it been so blatantly proposed to the human race that this is the sole function that we have. We're already being told that we won't be needed in the future to produce, that we will only be needed to consume, and we can only consume on certain very particular limited conditions with a central bank digital currency which can be controlled and programmed. So we will only be able to consume food, even necessities, if we behave ourselves in this new dispensation. The corruptibility of the world was a given all the time. The extent to which it wasn't yet totally corrupted was to do with waiting on the part of certain powers that are still in the shadows to a high degree, but who have now made themselves visible in all kinds of indirect ways to us. And it is clear that their intentions do not really include the happiness of the human race. do they necessarily include the existence of the vast majority of the human race? This is a different version of good and evil than anything we've ever understood before. This is a totalitarian, totalizing notion of evil in our midst. A thing that we never imagined was possible. We realized that actually this is a fight to the finish. They've shown their hand. Now they have everything to lose by losing. They can't afford to just say, okay, just having a laugh, you know, as you were. That's not going to happen. So it's to the finish. This is about as dark as it possibly could get, where we are now. We need to summon up our spiritual energies and to stop being reticent about them, to expand our concept of what it means, what is the spiritual dimension of man, and to really start to exercise those muscles again, because ultimately that's what they're trying to extinguish. Never ever underestimate anything you do or say, or even if there's one person listening, one gesture could have been the greatest thing in your whole life without you ever knowing that it was, because it might have moved that person in a way that you can't dream of, and that person may have then moved hundreds or thousands of others. That is the spiritual dimension that we're in. It's exciting, it's magical. People call it other names. They call it randomness, chance, or coincidence. You know, well, I say no, coincidence is a miracle in which God chooses to remain anonymous. We see lots of those if we actually are willing to see them. We're now in a situation really, to some extent, whereby when we get out of bed in the morning, we're not even sure if there's going to be a solid square foot of ground that we can put a foot on that won't sink under us. This is unprecedented in human history, as far as I know. I mean, I don't think there's been a moment like this. This is actually the meaning of why I'm here, why we're all here at this moment. This is a rare opportunity for us, because we were living in lies for so long, and now we have an opportunity to perhaps assert the truth against these lies. Sometimes in situations like this, really grave situations, you're in the middle of them and you are the person who has to do something. And you don't know what to do. You have no precedent, you have no example, you have no experience. I would, in good faith, make a decision to do something. And then I would act on that. And this has been my experience. And this is why I think the question of the spiritual dimension of reality is so complex, but so miraculous. Invariably, and in some ways this became more true the more grave the situation was. When I would act in that spirit, making a complete mess of it in my own mind, it would go wrong. In the world, it would fail. But the outcome, in a short time, would be completely miraculous, because it would have brought in new elements that I hadn't even dreamed of. That kind of is, to me, what faith really is understanding that, you know, we're not in control. We must take action. It's not that we just take our not in controlness to mean, well, we do nothing. No. You have to act. That we, in our ham-fisted, incompetent, ineffectual way, will blunder in. Not blunder in the sense that we don't think about it. We do. We reflect, we talk, we take advice. But then we trust that our best effort will be enough to effect the change that is necessary. And in my experience, that always happens. I don't mean it sometimes happens, it always happens. And I think that it will happen in this situation, even though the circumstances that face us appear to be impossible. They're not impossible. They're only impossible for me. I will be the one acting, but I will not be the one in control. Action is the magic word. Media started to argue against freedom of speech. Could this have been baked into the cake from the beginning? How did this happen so quickly? How did it happen overnight? I mean, it seemed to happen overnight. One day we woke up and the media were telling us that freedom wasn't any longer important. Like, they call themselves liberals. Liberal comes from liberty. But suddenly you said, no, liberty is not important. Those who are talking about liberty are far-right fanatics. We must protect the common good, which we define as however we please to define it. 25 years ago, I came up with a name for this stuff, which I'd love somebody to steal, but they won't steal it, and it's really good. It's the perfect name. I anticipated this era. I call it the era of the omnipotent victim. This person, by virtue of their victimhood, has all power. And you can see this now very clearly in the hate speech laws, that they can actually get you put in jail because they say you don't like them. You may like them, you may not care about them, you may never even give them a thought, but if they decide that you hate them, then you're in jail. That's omnipotence for victimhood. It's always this strange paradox about leftism, that its client base was always working class people, but its kind of hierarchies were almost always middle class people who, you know, were kind of looking down at these, and that made inevitable what happened, because, you know, at a certain point the left tired of its old base, the blue collar workers as the Americans call them, and decided we're going to bring in a kind of permanent base, and this is the culture Marxist idea. And what they did was basically they brought in a kind of coalition of victimologies who could become the client base of leftism, which could be nurtured and which could be imported from one country into another if you needed a particular booster of clients. They then took on these victimologies and created this sense that they were the custodians of these people, even though they weren't these people. They weren't even like these people, but they were able to patronize them and draw them into their web and use them as cannon fodder and as battering rams, and also as a kind of a permanent electorate that they could expand on at will almost through immigration. At that level, it's a very plausible business model for a political party in any jurisdiction in the West now to be able to do that. And you know, you see the Democratic Party in America, that's how it has sustained itself for several decades now. And of course that model has been now exported from America to Europe and is being applied to European countries willy-nilly, whether it applies or not, whether it's relevant or not. But you know, by virtue of the colour of somebody's skin, if somebody is allegedly white, then they are responsible for racism and for slavery and all that, and there's no way they can get out of that, you know. Liberalism isn't about freedom at all, never was. Fundamentally what it's about is changing the human race. It has a hatred of the human race. They invert everything. So now you see the opposite of family is promiscuity, hedonism, nihilism, drag queens with little children on their knees reading stories, abortion, trans, telling children that they can change their sex and it will be no cost. Telling children that actually they should be utterly happy, and if they're not, it's because they're in the wrong body. That is a crime, because it's called life. You know, if you're not happy in your body, the chances are you're just not happy in your body. I mean, who is always happy in their body? You're just unhappy sometimes. You're miserable sometimes. You're sad sometimes. You're grief-stricken. You're angry. You're all these things. It's called life. Cultural Marxism does this, and it started doing it with feminism, where it said to women, you see, you're ill at ease. You don't feel. Am I right? You're not feeling. You know. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, that's men's fault. Okay. Now, you know, as a man, I say, okay. Well, I don't feel so great at the moment either. Who do I blame for that? Can women be blamed? Oh no. All right. Okay. And then this went on. So women blame men, gays blame straights, you know, blacks blamed whites or pasty-faced people. They're basically weaponized human nature and decided it's some kind of deformity and that you can cure it by becoming different. And that's essentially what liberalism became, changing humanity into anything. The climate thing is really indicative of, again, the left's hatred of humanity. And these are human beings. You know, they're standing up on their hind legs as human beings, and they're saying that human beings are a scourge on the planet. I'm presuming that they exclude themselves, because their malevolence is such that it can't possibly be self-directed. So they have this idea that somehow they can be morally excluded from the charge sheet. The human race needs to disappear into the planet, or maybe just disappear altogether in order to preserve the planet. Well then, who will say, well done, you know, that was a great achievement? These leftists who were followers of Karl Marx, fine, yeah, okay, and working man and equality and egalitarianism and so on. But in the last 25 or 30 years, all the wealth and power has begun rising to the top. So that now something like BlackRock, one company, controls about sort of 95% of the world's wealth, right? They're all good with that, and they're opposing anybody who says anything nasty about the World Economic Forum. All these corporations, they're all good with all that, and they're good with their enrichment. Or at least they don't talk about it, you know, they don't ever criticize it, you know, and someone presumes that they're all happy with Bill Gates is now the richest owner of farmland in the United States. They regard that's fair enough, that's the free market, is it, or what? I don't know. What is it? The World Economic Forum. Now, I've often puzzled about that name. Why would they call it that? Because they don't really talk that much about economics. I mean, you don't hear economists make, you know, it's not a primary thing about it. It's not, it's more about wealth and power and, you know, politics. World Economic Forum. What is WEF? It's few backwards. The few. They're telling us there's just going to be us. You're going to be gone. And we're telling you. We've told you. It's so clear. Are you stupid? Well, I'm afraid so. Well, that's tough. You'll own nothing and be happy until one day when we think, why are we still subsidizing all these useless people all around? Do we, like, wouldn't the world be much better off without them? Wouldn't they be happier if they weren't here? I mean, they don't look all that happy. We tried to make them happy. We promised them happiness, but they just couldn't embrace it. Too disgruntled, you know, all the time protesting about this and that, you know. They just couldn't accept. Maybe we just have to rethink the whole thing. When man abolishes God, it never happens that all men become gods. Only a few men become gods. But that's who they are. They want to become gods. And they want us to go to hell. And they're going to build that hell for us just in case the real one doesn't exist. The next step is transhumanism. In a very short time, this will become a religious, I mean it, a religious precept. They're going to create religions out of transhumanism, transcendence, a new secular earthly transcendence. Unimaginable, but they can do it because they have the technology now. They can enter into people's minds and nanotechnology, all that. Our children's children will have gone to a place that is hell on earth, and there will be no way back for them because we will have forgotten the way the world was held together as it had been held together for 2,500 years by transcendent precepts, going back to pagan civilizations of ancient Greece and so on. You can feel the sense of passion and grief and renewal in the air. For all our lives, we have ignored this or we have derided this. Only now that it is almost becoming extinct, it is in mortal danger, do we realize and recognize how important this has been to us. And people are deeply moved by it, you know, old songs and things like that. It's, you know, it's quite overcoming really when you encounter that. But it is happening and it is growing really, really fast. We are here because we love this country and we love every grain of sand, every drop of rainwater, every blade of grass of this land. It's very salutary, you know, in context of that video of me reviewing myself in '87. You know, it's very important that we don't allow that to happen, where you kind of revise your perception of reality in the middle, just before it changes again. I wasn't wrong, you know, and you know, if I'd had the courage, that taught me that something, you know, don't, for God's sake, don't give in, because the revolution might be tomorrow morning and you're going to be left out of it then because you've just surrendered. I would say overall I'm an optimistic, but there are days, I have very dark days when I see what is happening to our beautiful country. I can just see that these guys have zero love for it. I mean, it's incomprehensible to me. We have a gargantuan task to keep going, but that's all we need to do. We don't need to have a plan, because you can't plan this. We had no way of knowing how this was going to go. We have to stay the course, always go back. Don't think the battle is over. You know, don't think your trial is ended. Your trial is never ended. And that's the hard thing, you know, to accept. Because, you know, we all have plans for our lives, you know, particularly as we go older and we're into the final furlong, we kind of think, oh, you know, now I'm going to chill out for a while, you know. But look, I'll have centuries for chilling out when I'm 6 foot under.